Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Welcome to Then and Now, and Happy New Year to our listeners. I'm your host, David Myers, from the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. The Luskin Center for History and Policy acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tavangar, on which our institution sits. I'm pleased to welcome today Mishuana Goeman, a member of the Tonawanda Band of Seneca, who is Professor of Gender Studies and American Indian Studies at UCLA, as well as an affiliated faculty member in Critical Race Studies in the UCLA Law School. Professor Goeman is the author of Mark My Words, Native Women Mapping Our Nations from 2013, a book that situates her as a leading scholar working at the intersection of Native American studies, critical theory, and settler colonialism. She's also the inaugural special advisor to the Chancellor on Native American and Indigenous affairs at UCLA. We want to talk to her today about her own evolution as a scholar, the state of Native American studies as a field, and the quest for justice for Native peoples in the United States. Welcome to Then and Now, Professor Goeman.
Nyawesikan. Hello, everybody. I'm happy to be here.
Great. So can you describe your path to scholarship? How do you recall the time when you first understood that this was a vocation for you?
Well, I actually didn't know when I first started off. When I was applying to colleges, I took a trip to Dartmouth and I realized how strong the Native community was there. And I decided that's where I want to go. I grew up in northern Maine. Expectations weren't necessarily that I would go to college. My family, as the oldest cousin, and I took care of all my younger cousins and tribal communities, that can be a lot. I lived with all my aunts and uncles in northern Maine in a place called 12 Corners. It was a piece of land that my grandfather actually bought, and then everybody lived in different areas on the land. Kind of made his own reservation in a sense. And we were halfway between some of the northern tribes, the Maliseet, the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy. So we were like kind of a stopping point on the way. So I kind of grew up in this place called 12 Corners in central Maine, northern central Maine. And so while I didn't grow up on my reservation, I went off and on. My dad was an iron worker. So we had two home bases, the Tonawanda and also Maine, where my mother, who's white, grew up. So I had that side of aspect too. My parents met in high school. So it was very much at that point in time, it's changed a lot, even recently over the last years, but it was mostly all white, very rural. And then there was my family, and I come from a family of rebels, a family of maybe troublemakers, somebody see it that way. But so that kind of our experience in Skowhegan, Maine, and Norridgewock, Maine, and Madison, Maine, that was all very much a part of how I came to think through who I was, my idea. When I first wound up at Dartmouth, it was the only college I applied to, and I got an early decision. So I only had enough money to apply to one or two schools. I think about now what kids go through. It's just so much work, and there's so much. They didn't have the ability back then, or at least I didn't know about it, to apply to multiple schools. So I had to make those decisions. And so it was the only school I applied to. And I partly applied to that school because of the large American Indian population, Native American population there. And that interested me a great deal. And it was out of the state of Maine. That's all I needed to know. So I ended up going to Dartmouth, and that gave me a different sensibility. That's actually the first time I ever really was questioned, because I am a light-skinned Indian. And that's the first time my identity was ever questioned. And it was kind of shocking to me, because I growing up in rural Maine as a racialized body in that sense could be very rough at times. There's a lot of violence, a lot of racism, and but there's also a lot of comradeship to camaraderie. It's a very mixed bag of feelings in those particular areas. And in the 70s, there wasn't as many multiracial relationships. So my parents, that was also a big thing. And so it is a little different than it is now, but it kind of definitely informed my thinking about the world. I was kind of thrown into Dartmouth, which is a very different life from somebody from poor rural northern Maine and the reservation.
So let me just maybe jump in and ask, how well formed would you say was your sense of yourself as a Native American when you arrived at Dartmouth?
Very, very. I didn't know the history though, and I didn't know the history of why my family was the way they were, or both my grandmothers were in boarding schools and residential schools, which is incredibly hard. And I think it accounts for a lot of fissures in our families. I had no idea about that history. I had no idea about the way Haudenosaunee people were treated. I feel very fortunate my kids actually know that history now, and I feel like a lot of American Indian kids in the next generation are learning these histories and have more opportunity to do so. Just because the field of Indigenous studies has grown, but also, the internet helps a lot with getting to know your own history, and there's been a revitalization and a resurgence. So since I was born in 1971, my dad was part of the American Indian movement. So that was those are my first memories, actually, him coming back from South Dakota, from AIM. He was at Wounded Knee. My aunts and my uncles were involved in the American Indian movement and were at Wounded Knee. I actually, as a child, was there. My mother went as well, which was very hard for her. Again, my family, my mom and dad were 16 and 17 when they had me. So they met down in Boston. They lived in the combat zone down in Boston, where Anime Aquash ran the Indian Center down there. So that's where my parents met, down there. People forget that there are several cities that were movement, even on the East Coast as well. Most people, when they think of how AIM developed, they think mostly of Minnesota, but it developed also in Boston. It was quite a strong community at the time.
So I want to get back to Dartmouth in a second, but I'm just curious about the politics, the political consciousness in your home. I mean, you mentioned your father was in AIM, and growing up, was that very much a sense of your own identity, that you were destined in life to be politically engaged, an activist, and a fighter for change?
I wouldn't say it was kind of considering yourself an activist. It's just who you are. Sovereignty wasn't an activist movement. Sovereignty is just who you are. Your people are sovereign, and it's who you are. So it wasn't kind of categorized as that's an activist mode. That's who you are. So like my family would post signs, no police allowed on our land. And I grew up with very much a sense, like a lot of Haudenosaunee children, even at that time, a sense of sovereignty, a sense of what that means inherently as like your own sovereign body, but also your own sovereign nation in the history of the US, that we are not Americans. I got kicked out of first grade because I wouldn't pledge allegiance to the flag. That's the political consciousness that you grow up with, knowing who you are when you're Haudenosaunee. You're not American, but there's like a nation to nation relationship. So I knew that before I ever took any Native Studies classes. Read Vine Deloria, whose work really moved me when I was in college, or met Wilma Mankiller, who really helped lead my way in my path forward. Louise Erdrich. I actually had such a good experience at Dartmouth because of the woman that I got to meet. Susan Shon-Harjo was probably the first time I realized the kind of path forward I wanted to take in activist scholarship and the work. She kind of took me under her wing. I was, there was a rough woman in college. We all have them. And I was just like, I don't know what I want to do. And she was a Montgomery Fellow. And she just had, instead of using the Montgomery Fellowship, they give you a really nice house on Ockham Pond at Dartmouth. Beautiful, beautiful place. And it becomes like a retreat for a lot of the fellows who get it. But Suzanne, instead of just keeping it as an isolated place to write or work or whatever, she opened it to all the Native students on campus, and she had like poker games. She invited us. She used those resources to really. She was just amazing, you know. So that was the kind of scholar, activist person that I wanted to be, in terms of, leading the nation. She was at that time really working against the Redskins in Washington. She was one of the first leaders to bring that lawsuit. So I was still thinking at that time of going to law school and how I could combine law school and activism together.
And what happened to redirect you to graduate studies at Stanford?
I weaned off grad school, or the idea of law school, and switched to grad school. Um, there was a professor actually that took a lot of us as Native women under her wings, and she would have dinner with us once a quarter. A lot of the Native women, and she wasn't Native, but she grew up. She had a really interesting story, and she grew up in the Dakotas, and she saw it as her kind of role. I remember her saying to me once, like, I want you and the others here to replace me. Your job as Native students is to replace me, and my job as a professor of Native American literature. So she kind of mentored and guided me, and eventually I did wind up replacing her when I went back to Dartmouth as a professor, which is kind of funny. But she passed away of cancer a couple days after I told her I completed a draft of my dissertation, and it was a pretty amazing moment. She was happy, and I'm glad I could give her that.
And one of the hallmarks of your work is a wide-ranging interdisciplinarity, and I'm wondering how you came to put together the various disciplines that made up your dissertation and your first book.
Yeah, well, maybe it was the weaning off of law, and I just know that as a American Indian person, the law informs your life on every single level, even what identities you can, just every little bits and pieces. In the way that American Indian law informs who you are, like it really impacts our lives. Even while there's a way that I always looked at American Indian law, or the legal system, American law, property law, is all part of that fictitiousness itself, just as much as a story. And at the first time I read Louise Erdrich's Love Medicine, it was such a beautiful book, and it was the first time I read a representation of myself. And I was just always very good at unpacking stories or telling stories, or in all of these sorts of elements. I used to, line up. Again, I was the oldest cousin, and much to their chagrin, I would make them all do plays to entertain my grandmother. At least that's what I said. Really was so that I could boss them all around and make them do a play with me. So I would love to tell stories in that way, through theater, etc. But I also really know that how the legal impacts us. And so I kind of started early on combining law and literature, but I saw literature as a catharsis, a way of looking forward, not just a way of dealing with the issues that face American Indian people now. Without those stories, I always think of Helena Maria Veramontes, the wonderful Chicana writer, when she says in The Making of Nopalitas, like, telling a story is being able to peek over the fence and seeing what's in the distance. So I feel like that's kind of what drew me to kind of the combinations that I have with geography, with literature, with looking at current social issues and social movements and thinking about where they're going. I think our artists and our writers are the ones that can really help vision that future forward, right? And so I think that's when I started combining.
What about scholars?
Scholars, yeah, I think I do believe that we can too, if we don't get caught up in our own heads too much, and also in kind of some of the politics that we have to work with on a daily basis, being in the academy. Sometimes
You want to unpack that a little? Some of the politics.
Yeah, I think sometimes, the academy is set up by disciplines. It's set up by traditional disciplines. It's set up by even humanities versus social science. Since I began my academic career, I've been in the humanities and the social science, because you need both. Like I can't, as an English professor, right? I have managed in my work to publish, on poetry, right, on a poem. But then in the social science, I'm also doing interviews with elders and going out to land-based, doing kind of land-based pedagogy work and land-based work. And that means the world to me, doing the land-based work. It just, it's something that I can't see. I don't see it as separate necessarily from the unpacking or doing a close reading of a poem either. For me, it's important to bring all of those kind of worlds together and tell those stories.
So some of those words you bring together in your book, Mark My Words, which centers Native women and Native American women's literature as a way of exploring what is a recurrent interest of yours, which is the ongoing legacy of settler colonialism in the United States and in Native American life. And so I'm wondering, maybe you can explain to us the significance of settler colonialism as a guiding paradigm in your work and how that intersects as part of your sort of interdisciplinary way with your study of literature.
So, so Mark My Words came about because of my lived experience, really. I thought about what it meant to think about territory differently in the ways that my family always thought about things differently, right? Like whenever we would go somewhere, we would introduce ourselves to the Native people that were around. Native people quickly found themselves. I didn't live at that point in time. There was a split between urban Indian versus res Indians, right? And I didn't fit in any of those paradigms because I was more like a traveling, migrating. I lived with my father in all different kinds of places. And we traveled with my father because my mother is white. So we lived on and off the res when my dad had a base, a job site that was closer to there. So, but I wasn't alone or isolated because we traveled with my aunts and uncles. I wish I was isolated sometimes. I was always with my cousins and always had to take care of them and that kind of thing. So we moved around as a family with other families and met other families, and there wasn't that sort of isolation that you're supposed to have if you're urban Indian or being separated from your homelands. So being separated from homelands is a real thing, though. I will say that, there's a lot that happens in those particular moments. So I started to think about the spaces of the body in relation to also the spaces of territory. And how do we get outside of property dynamics or the logics of property? So really, my work wasn't situated in settler colonialism until much later, but it was really unpacking the underpinnings of property. And Native studies, or Indigenous, Native American and Indigenous studies, has been doing that far longer than settler colonial studies has. I mean, some of the first works by Vine Deloria, even Ella Deloria in the 1800s, who's a predominantly Dakota writer, beautiful, anybody should read that work. She's unpacking kind of property logics in her work as well. I think Native languages and revitalization, when you work on that, it unpacks those kind of property logics. So I see my work more mired in Indigenous studies and in those stories that from Native people from the 1800s who have always contested the US and contested the settler colonial structures. I think settler colonialism gives us a word that helps us look at the structures, but Indigenous studies gives us a look into the past, present, and future of Native people. Like, I don't feel like settler colonial studies without Indigenous studies is a project that doesn't go anywhere, right? It's like, okay, you examined the problem of this structure, now what? Indigenous studies, I think, provides an avenue forward from being able to make an appraisement of the past, and also where we're not returning to it, the past, in a nostalgic way, but in a way to get those key elements to move forward. So when I took on thinking through the geographies in my work or remapping, that's why I used the parentheses in the re of the mapping, it's not a return to the past in a nostalgic manner, but it's taking what we need, those keys, those tools that our ancestors left us, and mapping a way forward and a future forward, and thinking about geographies differently outside of property logics, and beginning to think of them in ways where we have better land-based politics and land-based relationships. So that was the goal of that book. It wasn't just in, the legal aspects that come in the book. I start with the Confederation of Canada because people don't talk enough about the Canadian-US border and think about that critically enough also, right? Because that is part of the constructing. It is related to what drives me crazy is when people say the border and they mean the US-Mexico border, right? I'm like, no, there's more than one border. There's the borders, the nest, or what Roger Simpson calls nested sovereignties throughout the US. So I was trying to think of how can we reconceptualize this space so that people can understand also that the US is not a done project. So I start with 1876 and I start with E. Pauline Johnson, who's an amazing Mohawk writer who contests very clearly the way that like Canada and the US are co-constitutive states, settler states, right? So I do start there because I think there's other ways that we can reconceive of space and geographies in the US where it's not so extractive, it's not so settler in nature in that element. And I think of this a lot. I think of this in working towards climate change issues, for instance. I recently, we may have been in the same meeting, I'm not sure, David, but there was a meeting where a person was like, we can't look at the past because we were talking about bringing traditional ecological knowledge from the local tribal people, the Gabrielino Tonva, into conversation with climate change issues that UCLA will face. And this is in my role as special advisor. And they're like, well, the past isn't going to help us. And I was like, that's not, if you're thinking about who knows how drought works in the Los Angeles County, the people that hold the most knowledge about land, waterways, et cetera, are Gabrielino Tonva people and the Paiute people from where our water comes from. That's not returning to a past. That's actually returning to the things that's going to save us in the future. If people so choose to think about that critically in a way. So I think too much Native people are so put in the past that settler colonial studies only leaves it there. It doesn't move us forward to think about the future. Indigenous studies does that.
Right. And it seems to me from what I have grasped that you think it's really important that we take full advantage of the tools, the analytic and conceptual tools that were present in Native peoples, not just in scholarship about Native peoples or scholarship about settler colonialism. You think there is some very valuable trove of tools to draw on. And is that something that you in your scholarly life attempt to do, to sort of fuse, as it were, Western epistemologies with sort of Native conceptual modes that allow us to think past, say, as you would put it, property in its conventional Anglo-American way?
Yeah. You have to deal with the Western because it's always there, right? Even though you work towards land back, for instance, which is a big movement right now, even if you're thinking of that, when people are saying land back, too often people are like, well, that's just ridiculous. That's not gonna work. We're not gonna give it back, whatever. Private property ownership, blah, blah, blah. When Native people are saying that, they're not, people would like their land back. I want to be clear there, but it's also not in terms of property driven. It's providing the ability for Native people to maintain their relationship and caretake those sites, have access to their weaving materials, say, or whatever materials they want, and be able to have sovereignty over those spaces as well. And you have to deal with federal Indian law, which is a lot property-based. A lot of professors of American Indian law, they're the ones that also teach property law, which is the basis really of the US. I think about Casey Park's work here. She's a brilliant legal professor at Georgetown, but she also has a PhD in history, I think, as well. She has a couple PhDs and it's a law professor. She's brilliant. But she in the Keywords in Gender and Sexuality studies that just came out, talked about the relationship of property that develops through colonialism and slavery. And so those are intertwined through how we come to conceive of property, but property didn't even have the same kind of meaning until the 1600s with colonization. So I think we have those kind of different ideas of how property develops, but it leads into, we have to also talk about, I think about the Gabrielino Tomva in my work with them, and they still have a relationship to land outside those property logics. And even though their land is subdivided, divided, there's no access coast to the coastal line. If any of your listeners ever have land to donate on the coast, I'm sure the Gabrielino Tomva would love that, to be able to watch their tiat. And I think these paths forwards are going to be mired in thinking outside like private property and ownership in that particular way.
To follow up on that, how does sovereignty connect to existing logics of property? How does it, as you understand it, connect to or escape that traditional sort of essentially capitalist ownership model of property?
So in my research in the first book, right, and I was trying to be very careful of this after, you rewrite your tenure book for the fourth or fifth time. But the first time I wrote it, it was like, I'm not saying get rid of territory, because territory is what's protected us as community in those relationships to land. We have to deal with that on some level, that American Indian law and how Indian country is actually defined in American Indian law. We have to deal with all the different ways land is categorized through the legal apparatus as well. Fee land, trust land, all of it, right? We have to deal with that. We don't have that option not to. But I think in the quotidian, in the everyday practices of Native people, you can have sacred sites, and there's so many sacred sites across Los Angeles that I have been fortunate that the Gabrielino Tomva shared to me. It gives me a different perspective of the land itself in LA. But you can still, even though those logics exist, what really matters as a people is that relationship that exists outside those property logics. And that's the passing down of different knowledges, indigenous geographies, et cetera, that become important. Laura Harjo has talked about emergent geographies, which is the way that Native people now are forming relationships with different groups of people, but also within their own communities to develop their own geographic tools to put forward sovereign practices of territory, et cetera, as well. So,
and what role do you see Native American and Indigenous studies playing in that project? In other words, how fluid is and permeable is the boundary between academy and community? Should Native American Indigenous studies be front and center in this reimagining of the landscape of this land?
That's a hard question, because it really depends how things are conceived. I would say yes. I really believe. I feel at UCLA we're lucky because a lot of the scholars there are able to use their disciplinary methods to promote healthy and wellness in Native communities. I think of the work of Randall Akey with looking at child obesity and through economic practices. I think of Angela Riley in the law school. She really does do a lot through the legal practices. I think it's how we translate it to community members. And sometimes academics are not good at that translation process. Sometimes we have so much to learn from tribal community members. Sometimes it can be, but we have to do that with reciprocity as well. We can't be extractive, and we have to have that reciprocity in our practices. And I just think the academy as a whole should learn to have reciprocity with whatever groups they're working with, not just Native groups, but most of our groups, we should have that reciprocity. And then I actually I actually think that developing those tools and those skill sets are very important for our students to learn as they move forward as well. Most people don't realize, but in some states like Minnesota, UMN has done a great job at training firefighters. They get a certificate through the Indigenous Studies Department for forest and fire stuff. But the tribes in Minnesota are some of the biggest employers, not just of Native people, but in general, as a part of the economy. And we see the same in California as well, where Indigenous, in some of the rural areas where Indigenous communities are, they're some of the highest employers as well. In Florida, the Seminole, they've done a really good job at this. So that's to say, if we can create tools to really help train people, not just Native kids, but everybody, to understand the importance of Indigenous sovereignty, to understand their own histories and how they came to be on whosever Indigenous land they're on. If we can train people to do that, we can have more respectful and reciprocal relationships back and forth.
Well, you may now be in a position to advance that project because, as we mentioned at the outset, you are now the special advisor to the Chancellor on Native American Indigenous Affairs at UCLA. What is that job, and what do you hope to do in it?
There's a lot on the surface that I feel can be done, and then there's a lot that happens on the non-surface that's confidential and can be very tricky at times. But some of the projects that I've taken up is trying to make UCLA opens its doors a little wider, open it, create more of a presence with the Gabrielino Tomva on campus. One of the first things we did is work on the land acknowledgement. And that wasn't just something that was a whim and that I threw together. I talked to the tribal elders about what they wanted in this process. And they wanted to use their language, and they wanted to be seen not as something that had just been lost or stolen from, but they wanted to see that they wanted the acknowledgement to make it clear that they are in relationship with the students that are emerging and coming out of UCLA. So that was just the first step. I look at them, I rephrased them. I don't call them land acknowledgements. I call them land introductions, because once you're introduced to somebody, then you have to have a response, you'd start to develop that relationship. So in some of the other work that I've done that's out in a journal, Western Humanities Review, I talk about the land introduction. So that's how I look at it. When I worked with the elders on that, they very clearly didn't want us to be seen as just a tragic figure of the past. That can be a problem with land introductions. But they wanted students to think about their water in the daytime, think about their own ancestors, think about their emerging relationships with the Gabrielino Tomva, with the land around them, and how that would work itself out. They had been working on a plaque for 20 years, and again, it's just a plaque, but there's now a plaque on campus that's next to Founders Rock. So that creates some of the first presence, like a actual physical presence on the land at UCLA. So those are some of the first two projects that I work on. And from there, I've been working on thinking about how to open up the campus to develop more relationships between the tribal community members and the students and the staff and the faculty in different disciplines across the university. So that hasn't been easy because of COVID, and our campuses are constantly being shut down. We do have a planning. We just rearranged the date because it was on January 15th, but now it's on January 29th. Anybody's welcome to come out. And in that, I've been working with Victoria Stork, who's the director of the Mildred Mathis Botanical Gardens. And with that, working with Victoria, they're working on making a basket weaving garden so that the Tomva don't have to travel 2 hours away to get their basket weaving materials. So that's one aspect, planting native plants in the botanical gardens. I work at Caravagna Springs, which is a traditional village site, which is a very important site. It's on Uni High's campus. It's open the first Saturdays of every month, and everybody is welcome. I mean, it's been amazing. It's been revitalized by Robert Ramirez, who is the president of the Caravagna Springs, and he was a general contractor and landscaper, so he knows what he's doing. So he's combining and building that site, which is all native plants. So during that process, I've been working with the landscape and ecological sustainability practices at UCLA, who are redevising the outdoor spaces around campus, right? Because as many people may or may not know, UCLA has a space crisis. And I kind of knew we weren't going to get a building for Native students. I hope someday in the future there's a way to get a building. But I do know we have lots of beautiful outdoor spaces on campus. And I do know that it's not just a matter of planting native plants. There was a movement a couple of years ago. There started, white sage started planting around campus and other native plants. But there's a caretaking. It's not you leave a plant and let it grow. You have to have that caretaking process. So in my role as special advisor, I'm trying to work on developing more of a caretaking process on campus, and the overall plan, which is looking 20 years out and trying to also work with climate change on our landscape in those outdoor spaces on campus. Bringing in Gabrielino Tomville voices and thinking through the plants that they need to be planted so that they can harvest and gather and caretake them as well. So that's what we're working on, creating those spaces and harvest, gathering, and caretaking in which they can share their knowledge with people in life sciences. I've been working with Sage Hale and Kelly Norberg, she's just been amazing. She's come out to Caravagna to look at to help work that land and traditional native planting and stuff. We have a lot of students from life science, grad students coming, and professors coming out to give back in that reciprocal way as well at Caravagna Springs. UCLA is developing a great relationship. David Shorter helped with a grant recently with the Theodore Payne Institute to do that traditional planting. So I brought our groundskeepers and our sustainability officer, Narit, to Caravagna Springs so that they could see that this isn't just a talking about planting native plants, but this is what it means to be in community with those plants, to caretake those plants and help develop them. So those are some of the projects that I've been working on as special advisor. And then there's other ones like, I'm sure many students who might be listening will understand this, but working on financial aid practices and how to respond better to tribal scholarships, which can be quite difficult because each tribe has their own ways they hand out scholarships and processes. But yeah, we're trying to lead workshops on improving those experiences for our students in terms of retention and recruitment as well.
So it sounds like, in a certain sense, the transition has been somewhat seamless from scholar and critic and activist, someone with a critical perspective toward predominantly white institutions, to then being a representative, and indeed a very visibly identifiable representative of one large institution. What has that been like, and what has it been hard to navigate, or has it sort of flowed naturally?
Well, sometimes I think it's been difficult. It hasn't flowed naturally. Again, we've been working with COVID, and I think it's impacted Native communities so badly. Losses from our, staff having losses to even most of us have from reservation communities have lost really important elders and people, first language speakers and things like that. People, who hold whole libraries. So I think I wish there was something more I could do there. It makes it hard. But it's seamless, and it's not like, as an academic, I still have to produce research. That hasn't always been as seamless. We run on grants at UCLA a lot of times. A lot of the work that I'm doing is grant work. I have a grant now centering tribal stories in time of disaster. And they have timelines, but tribal communities don't have the same timelines. And so you're trying to, err and be careful and, work with people, get lots of their feedback. I never just publish one thing. I always, even the land introduction article, I gave all the community members that helped me work on it, like 20 people, the ability to, just tell me what you don't like. I don't, I'll change it or whatever. I always ask the community what they think on all of my projects. So it's just been a process. And I think sometimes in academia, you wind up doing two jobs, right? Like the stuff that I publish on has largely been as a literary scholar. And then there's or as a settler colonial studies scholar, interdisciplinary American studies. I'm heavily active in American studies as well. Um, so there's that. But then, people don't understand necessarily the digital projects that I do, the digital humanities projects. They're harder than writing a book. It's just so much work because you have to run it back and forth with the community. It's always changing. It has the dynamics to change, which is a wonderful thing, but that also means you have to constantly be changing things and keeping up with projects. So there's that. So I see that as the praxis of my theoretical work a lot of times.
Right. It's a good way to think of it. And just building on that, what do you hope for this institution, for UCLA? What's your vision of where UCLA should be? If you were to realize, the potential of this position and mobilize people in ways maybe even beyond your imagination, where would it lead? What would the institution look like with respect to Native American people and their presence?
We have such a great opportunity as one of the largest Indigenous cities in the world, in terms of in the U.S., population wise, especially if we consider, which I do, Latin American Indigenous studies populations. There's just so many Indigenous populations within the state of California. I think we have a potential if we could make space. Literally, the only department that does not have space on campus, or soon to be department, is American Indian Studies. The students don't have, they have, they don't have the space.
Pretty haunting symbol.
Yeah. And I really feel like other universities now are creating spaces that are meaningful, even right down to the architectural aspect being meaningful. Like there's a beautiful longhouse space that they have at University of Oregon, where it's just like all cedar and everything's really important. And they have a kitchen and they have a garden where students can have their traditional plants and have traditional medicines that are needed. That's what I would like to see. I would like to see a beautiful, beautiful place for our students. Like at Cornell, they have a beautiful house that's shaped like it's all Haudenosaunee focused in many ways, because those are the traditional keepers of that land. But everybody's welcome and everybody learns from that. And it's just, some of these other universities that are really thinking about how do we create a space with land-based pedagogies. I would really like to see UCLA into that foray. And I feel like there's a lot of people that would love to see that. And it's a way that it doesn't just sustain Native students, because often people are like, oh, it's such a small population compared to the rest that we should forget about it or whatever. But there's just so much knowledge that could be had there, and outside of a numbers game. Sometimes the way we think in the academy is too based on numbers or algorithms, running off these business models. And I don't think we should ever do that. We should always think, I think about Black feminist scholars who always say, the Combahee River Collective, look at those who are the most vulnerable populations. I learn a lot from my Black feminist colleagues around this stuff. And I feel we have to learn from each other in those ways. And outside of these algorithms and how many, bodies per seat we serve or any of that. Everybody should know whose land they're on, those histories, the meaning, what the land around them's like. Everybody should know where their water comes from. So that's what I would like to see for our teaching, for everybody to take a class in AIS. And then for the department and the students, I would like to see a really nice space.
So thank you for sharing that vision. And as a final question, I want to zoom out even further and ask you, where do you think we are at in the struggle for justice for Native Americans today? I ask this a day after the Canadian government announced a major new program to compensate First Peoples to the tune of 40 billion Canadian dollars for the removal of children and placement in state educational and child welfare institutions. So this is a path of financial compensation. You've talked about land back, land introductions. Where do we need to go in the United States in terms of reparative justice? If you could just sort of, in kind of broad summary fashion, give us your sense of where this country needs to go.
So in terms of the UC, very simply, I think California Indians especially should have free tuition in our university systems. Our university systems have made so much money from being on California Indian land that's the very least that could be done. And there's a whole history there that is very complicated with the losing of treaties conveniently. And California Indians just really had a brutal time of colonization that's pretty recent. So I really believe that every California Indian should be able to attend one of the UCs. Once they're admitted, it should be tuition free. And it wouldn't actually break the bank or anything, but it has to go through the state legislature. That's one of the first things I tried to do at UCLA when I was appointed special advisor, but but it has to go through the state legislature, is what I was told. But that's a very easy reparative justice thing that could happen. Then in terms of the broader lands, I believe like unused lands should be given back and back to Native communities to have that kind of sovereignty over it. It'll be interesting to see how the recent decision in Oklahoma, the McGirt case, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in terms of reparative justice. I highly suggest if anybody wants to follow up on that, they look at Angela Riley did a special in the law school on that as well through their Native Nations and Tribal Policy Institute. I would really like to see more moments like that, where land is returned to Native people by the states or even at the federal land reserve level. That's where I see that reparative justice can start to go as well. And more universities should also be thinking about where their land is and providing free tuition for displaced people. University of Oregon, anybody who was displaced from the state of Oregon, they have a tuition fee waiver. Colorado just instituted one because Colorado was one of those states where they kind of made an architecture of it as white by pushing Native people out of the state. It was very intentional. So most of these states really have to think about that free tuition waiver as a whole.
Well, this has been a very wide-ranging and I should say stimulating conversation. And I thank you for both sort of sharing larger visions and very specific and concrete proposals for reparative justice. It's really been a delight. Thank you, Professor Mishuana Goeman, for joining us on this episode of Then and Now.
Well, thank you, everybody. And if you want any more information on these decisions or on education tools and kits, please visit Mapping Indigenous LA.
Great. Thank you to our listeners as well. Have a good and safe day.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Maya Ferdman, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.